So the next speaker, the next keynote speaker I will be calling on, will talk about Tony and my journey from CSR to PSR. He is a professor at the Asian Institute of Management. Let's all give a warm welcome to Dr. Francisco L. Roman.
Thank you and good evening. I am personally delighted to be here because, in a way, if it hadn't been for Tony, I would still be in CSR. So he got me involved in PSR, which we'll talk about a little bit. And I'm also delighted to be here because it's a chance to meet the youth. When you get to be my age, everybody's either retired or in the grave. So at least here I can see some of the younger people. I consider Tony young. But I'm supposed to give a reflection about the journey. The trouble with journeys is they move from the past to the present and then the future. But our audience here is kind of bimodal, very young and old. And young people like to hear about the future because they have a short past and a long future. On the other hand, people like me, the old people, like to talk about the past because we have a long past and a short future. So I'd like to kind of balance that off, and there are 3 points that I'd like to make. So this journey is going to talk, obviously, about the past and where we are now, but I'm going to try to spend a little bit more time on the future, because I think that's what the youth are interested in. So I've got 3 points to make, and I'll try to make them fairly brief. The one important point is that I'm an academic, and the problem is we understand things in hindsight. We study this and we say, oh, this was the decade of X, this was the decade of Y. But in fact, the real world is a little bit complicated. In one sense, the other reason that I'm grateful to Tony is he introduced me to someone you may know, a gentleman named Wayne Visser. And he was the one who popularized CSR 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. But again, that's an academician talking. Neither he nor I talked about PSR, and that's why Tony decided to evolve that concept of PSR, which again, I'll get to in a little while. But one of the things I think we want to point out is that as an academician, it's easy to say, well, this was the decade of public relations. This was the decade of community relations. This was the decade of multi-stakeholder engagement, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll always look back. But in fact, the real world is a bit messy. There are many overlaps. I mean, even while you're doing what you would think is CSR, there's a great deal of public relations involved. Right now in AIM, we're looking at disasters, both man-made and natural. I was talking to my colleague. There's Yolanda, which is a natural disaster, and there's Marawi, which is a man-made disaster. And we're studying both, and we're looking at where can social responsibility exist there. And it's obvious that when a company does good things, it's also got PR involved. So it's very difficult to separate the two. And academicians like to do it, but there's no point in our doing it, because that's how the real world operates. There are also pendulums in terms of how CSR evolves. And I'll talk about it in the third point, but sometimes CSR is very internal oriented, sometimes CSR is very external oriented. I'll give you an example in a little while. So there are overlaps, there are pendulums, and there are cycles. Sometimes, in good times, there's a lot of CSR. In bad times, whether you like it or not, together with the advertising budget and other things, they cut back on CSR. So when we talk about it, it seems very clear. But in the real world, it's not that clear. And the point I wanted to make is exactly the point the previous speaker made, that actually personal social responsibility began in the decade of, when was that, Dr. Tupon? About the 90s, when Tony set it up, early 90s? So you see, it's been going around for a while. It's only now that it's getting traction. And again, partly because, like I said, the real world is messy. We didn't recognize its importance until now. So the first thing is that we have to understand what is going on, and we have to understand how things are working. But the other point, this gets me to the next point, talking more about personal social responsibility. You have to start fairly young, and I'm going to give a different example. Tony and I are involved in a project on STEM, science, technology. But I'm not going to go into that project. It's a little bit there's a lot of work on it. It's a project report. I'm going to just give you two images. I don't know how many of you have gone to Greenbelt during lunchtime, where you see all of these kids lined up going to Rapunzel. How many of you have seen it? You know, there are like hordes of them. They're watching Rapunzel, and there's this somebody with number one. There's a school name, number two, another school name, different uniforms. And okay, that's good. I think it's good for them to get creative. But I'll give you a different example. I've been teaching in Nagoya for the last 3 years, and purely by accident, I went into the Museum of Science that Nagoya has. That Nagoya has. It's the third largest city. And that museum is dedicated to the youth learning engineering and math. And it was in Japanese, obviously. But when I was looking at it, they were trying to, I don't know, how many of you here remember something called the Fibonacci ratio? It's a theorem that describes the ratio. But anyway, these kids were learning it intuitively. These kids were learning physics intuitively. Of course, it was in Japanese, but I could understand what they were doing, and I could see how much they had learned. And it struck me that the Philippines has a long way to go in building not just the creative arts, which are important, but also engineering and science. In the same way, we have a long way to go in building personal CSR. We've got to start early with the youth. With apologies to our business and corporate people, it's difficult to get them to think about personal CSR when they get brainwashed by the corporation. By the way, I use brainwash in the good sense of the word. I mean, they have budgets, they have resources, they have programs. So if you're a young person who's not sure about what he wants, he's going to embrace it. But I think what we're missing out is the ability for young people to come up with their own ideas and make themselves heard. I've observed also in corporations that the CSR managers are becoming younger and younger. I think that's a good sign. But anyway, the point I wanted to make is that in the journey that Tony and I took, I was very much brainwashed into CSR. That was how it worked. That was what I was familiar with. That was what the people I was talking to were about. Every year we have an annual award on CSR, et cetera, et cetera. So it's only when I realized, when I met that Tony and I got together, two things happened. One is I realized that there's an entire dimension to CSR which I'm missing, which is the youth. The second thing I realized is that the youth actually have something to say. And for a while, 2 years ago, I was doing work in University of Mindanao, in San Carlos, and in UP Los Baños. In other words, not the Ateneo, LaSalle, Makati crowd, but there's where we got a chance to see how they were doing. And there's where I understood that there's so much that they can do, it's just that they're not recognized. And partly they don't have a chance. If you join a company, basically they have their own CSR programs in place. Performance metrics are based on the CSR. So I don't think they get a chance to voice their interests and their priorities until they rise through the ladder, which is also the benefit. And that's why I think when Greg, no, not Greg. Ooh, wait, Federico, Fred, Eric. So when Eric mentioned this thing about what they're doing. To make an impact, to get people's voices heard, I think this is an opportunity for the youth to have their say and to be able to listen to them, because I think it's important that CSR is not just for us old-timers, it's for the people who are going to make a difference in the future. That's the third thing about this journey. Again, my thanks to Tony. I wouldn't have been able to do this. Two, I got a network, the people that he talks to. So through him, I've done conferences in UP in other places. I've gone to Pampanga. I'm a southerner. I'm from Laguna, so going to Pampanga is a major effort. All that traffic. Getting to the highway. Once you get to the highway, you're okay. Just to repeat, one, this is about the journey. I've talked a little bit about the past. Two, The journey is a complicated one. It's not, in hindsight, we can say that this was the decade of public relations, this was the decade of multi-stakeholder engagement, but it's nice to know that things are moving even faster than academicians can look at it. The third thing is a personal social responsibility. Like science and technology, you've got to start them young, get them early and enthusiastic about it. And one of the things, for example, that we noticed in talking about the youth is they really are environmentally conscious. They just don't know what to do about it, but they really are conscious about the environment. They're conscious about, human rights is a tricky word. They're conscious about a level playing field for people because they're looking from their point of view. I want to be able to do as much as I can when I leave college and I start having a life. So they're concerned about developing a level playing field, about equity. And these are the things I think that the young people are concerned about. Of course, how would I know? I'm 70 years old. Oops, let me just check. Sorry. Okay, yes, no, I should be ending. I have my timer here. The fourth and final point, and here we now talk about the future. It's interesting because I think the way we're going to go is corporations are now both external and internally inward-looking. Corporations are now external-looking for two reasons. One, the national government has priorities: education, health, and now the disasters are becoming the new normal, and corporations have to play their role as good corporate citizens. So they're looking at it externally. However, corporations are looking at it internally. They're very much concerned now with health and wellness. It's, of course, they're very selfish about it because this is data from the United States. The issue of chronic diseases, diabetes, high blood pressure, cholesterol, that's affecting productivity. And so that many of corporations are now looking inwards and saying we have to improve the health and wellness and well-being of our employees because they're the best example of corporate social responsibility. Also, I'm doing some research on something called presentism. I mentioned this to Tony. So what is presentism? You're physically in your office, but you're not productive. No, think about it. Your poor secretary who is a single mother has to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, prepare for it in order to be able to get to work at 8 o'clock. And very often, by the time she gets there to sit down, she's physically there, but she's simply not productive enough. Do you remember this ad about in the pharmaceutical industry about, is it Enervon, something like, because I cannot afford to be sick? Remember what's the Tagalog phrase? Bawal magkasakit. So that's the idea of presentism. It's not just health, and it affects the youth. I mean, before we can rise up and start buying BMWs, we've got to go through the MRT. So that's one of the internal issues. External issues, and let me end very quickly now. The external issues is one. You can Google this. There's something now called the beneficial corporation and the B corporation. You can look at it in Google. It's basically an attempt to develop a standard of good housekeeping, and you can register for it. It's like the global scorecard in corporate governance that ICD has. So that's one of the things that's happening. The other thing that's been happening is corporate social responsibility among corporations is now moving to social innovation. However, I think the youth are the ones who are going to propel social innovation through social entrepreneurship. I think many of the awardees we have are also engaged in social entrepreneurship. And the good thing about them is they don't have the baggage that corporations have. It's not that easy for a corporation to seed money for social entrepreneurship. And that's why the awards that Deloitte has and the initiatives that happen in some of the awardees provide us with good material and give us hope that the youth is actually doing well without us getting in the way. And I think maybe that's the main message, especially among the millennials. Let them be able to do their own thing, because it's their own personal journey. It's not something that came from mandated by somebody else. And so with that in mind, let me conclude, and more power to the awardees whom we're going to be hearing from in the next few minutes. Thank you very much.